In the winter of 1942, deep within the frozen hell of Auschwitz, a Polish Catholic priest named Maximilian Kolbe made a decision that would never appear in any history textbook. While the world knows him as the saint who volunteered to die in place of a stranger, almost no one knows about the other prisoners who followed his example of resistance in ways far more disturbing, far more calculated, and infinitely more dangerous. This is the story of one man who turned the camp's own weapon of death against the SS guards themselves, using nothing but tiny insects and an iron will to survive. His name has been lost to time, but his act of biological warfare inside the gates of hell remains one of the most shocking and forgotten acts of defiance in World War II. Auschwitz was not just a death camp. It was a laboratory of human suffering, a place where the Third Reich perfected the art of breaking the human spirit before extinguishing the human body. By early 1943, the camp system had expanded into a sprawling empire of torture, with Auschwitz-Birkenau serving as its crown jewel of annihilation. Approximately 1,300,000 people would pass through its gates, and over 1,100,000 would never leave. The prisoners lived in wooden barracks designed for 52 horses, but crammed with over 400 human beings. They slept on wooden planks infested with lice, fleas, bedbugs, and rats. Disease was not just common, it was guaranteed. Typhus, spread by body lice, killed thousands. Dysentery turned the latrines into scenes from Dante's Inferno. But here's what they don't teach you in school. The SS guards knew exactly what they were doing. They weaponized disease. They controlled who lived and who died, not just through gas chambers and firing squads, but through systematic neglect, turning the barracks into incubators of plague. The prisoners were not just victims. They were observers. They learned. They adapted. And some of them began to think like scientists, like guerrilla fighters, like men who had nothing left to lose. Among them was a prisoner whose identification number has been erased from records, a man who worked in one of the camp's medical blocks. His job was to assist the Nazi doctors in their grotesque experiments, but in reality, he was forced to witness the slow extermination of his fellow prisoners through disease. He watched as typhus ravaged entire barracks. He saw men scratching their skin until it bled, delirious with fever, their bodies covered in the red rash that signaled the beginning of the end. And then he noticed something that the SS guards had overlooked in their arrogance. The disease didn't care about uniforms. It didn't care about ideology. Typhus was an equal opportunity killer, and the only thing standing between the guards and infection was distance. But distance could be closed. The medical block where this prisoner worked had access to something the rest of the camp did not: live samples of typhus-infected lice and bedbugs. These insects were kept in jars for the Nazi doctors to study, to perfect their understanding of how quickly disease could spread, how efficiently it could kill. The irony was suffocating. The very tools the Nazis used to measure death could be turned into weapons. And this nameless prisoner, watching the guards stroll through the camp with their polished boots and their casual cruelty, began to formulate a plan so audacious, so insane, that it could only have been born in a place where sanity itself had been exterminated. He started small. During his shifts in the medical block, he began to pocket tiny vials, no larger than a thumbnail, and fill them with bedbugs that had fed on the blood of typhus patients. These insects were living syringes of death. One bite could transmit the bacteria Rickettsia prowazekii, the microscopic killer responsible for epidemic typhus. The symptoms would begin in 1 to 2 weeks: high fever, headache, delirium, and eventually, in untreated cases, death. The prisoner knew this. He had seen it dozens of times. And he also knew that the SS guards, despite their supposed Aryan superiority, were just as vulnerable to infection as the prisoners they tormented. They slept in barracks too, separate from the prisoners, but still within the camp. They had beds with mattresses, with sheets, with warmth, and those beds could be infiltrated. The plan was simple in its brutality. The prisoner would collect the infected bedbugs over the course of several weeks, hiding them in his clothing, in the folds of his striped uniform. And then, when the opportunity arose, when he was assigned to a work detail that took him near the SS quarters, he would release them, not all at once. Not in a way that would draw suspicion, but slowly, methodically, seeding the beds of the men who had turned Auschwitz into a vision of the apocalypse. This was not justice. This was not heroism in the way we like to imagine it. This was revenge, cold and calculated, carried out by a man who had been stripped of everything except his will to fight back. And what he was about to do would turn the camp's own system of extermination against the exterminators themselves. The opportunity came in the spring of 1943, during one of the rare moments when the rigid hierarchy of Auschwitz showed a crack. The camp operated on a system of kapos, prisoners who were given authority over other prisoners in exchange for slightly better treatment and the illusion of power. Some kapos were brutal collaborators who beat their fellow inmates with the same savagery as the SS. Others walked a tightrope, trying to protect their people while surviving themselves. The prisoner with the hidden vials had managed to secure a position on a work detail assigned to maintain the camp infrastructure, which meant he occasionally crossed into areas normally forbidden to regular inmates. This included the zone near the SS barracks, where guards lived in relative comfort compared to the skeletal prisoners just hundreds of feet away. The contrast was obscene. While prisoners slept shoulder to shoulder on wooden slabs crawling with vermin, the SS enjoyed individual beds, clean linens that were washed weekly, and heating stoves that actually worked through the Polish winter. The work detail was tasked with repairing a drainage system that had backed up near the guard quarters, a job that required several days of access to the area. The SS overseers assigned to watch the prisoners were lazy, confident in the electric fences and machine gun towers to prevent escape. They spent most of their time smoking cigarettes and joking among themselves, occasionally barking orders, but rarely watching closely. This negligence was the fatal flaw in their security, the tiny opening that the prisoner had been waiting for. He had prepared for this moment with the patience of a man who understood that one mistake would mean immediate execution, not just for him, but potentially for dozens of others in a collective punishment. The vials were hidden in a small cloth pouch he had sewn into the inner lining of his striped jacket. Each vial contained approximately 20 to 30 bedbugs, gorged on the blood of typhus victims, their tiny bodies swollen and reddish-brown, each one a biological time bomb. On the second day of the drainage repair, the prisoner made his move. The SS guards had retreated to a nearby building for their midday meal, leaving only one young guard to watch the work detail. This guard was new, barely 20 years old, and more interested in staying warm than in supervising a group of starving men digging in frozen mud. The prisoner volunteered to carry buckets of debris to a dump site that was positioned behind the SS barracks, a task no one else wanted because it meant extra walking in the cold. The guard waved him off without a second glance. As the prisoner walked past the long wooden building that housed 30 SS men, his heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. The windows were closed against the cold, but he could see through the gaps in the curtains. Beds lined up in neat rows, each one made with military precision, each one a target. He didn't have much time, maybe 5 minutes before someone noticed he was taking too long. The prisoner moved to the back of the barracks, where a small window had been left slightly open for ventilation, a common practice even in winter to prevent the buildup of moisture and mold. His hands shook as he pulled the first vial from his jacket. The bedbugs inside were sluggish from the cold, but still alive, still infectious. He removed the cork stopper and tilted the vial toward the window gap, tapping it gently. The insects tumbled out, falling onto the wooden sill and immediately seeking warmth, crawling through the narrow opening into the barracks. He repeated this process with 3 more vials, distributing the bedbugs at different points along the building's perimeter where ventilation gaps existed. The entire operation took less than 4 minutes. When he returned to the worksite, no one had noticed his absence. The waiting was the hardest part. For the next 2 weeks, nothing happened. The prisoner continued his routine, waking before dawn, standing for roll call in the freezing darkness, working until his hands bled, choking down the watery soup that barely kept starvation at bay. He began to think the plan had failed, that the bedbugs had died in the cold, or that the SS had somehow discovered and eliminated them. But then, on a grey morning in late March, whispers began to circulate through the camp. 3 SS guards had been hospitalized with high fevers and severe headaches. By the end of the week, that number had grown to 11. The camp administration was in a panic, conducting inspections of the guard barracks, searching for the source of what they suspected was an outbreak of typhus among their own men. The irony was lost on no one who knew the truth. The same disease the Nazis had allowed to ravage the prisoner population was now eating through their ranks, and they had no idea it had been deliberately introduced by the very people they considered subhuman. The camp's response to the outbreak revealed just how deeply the SS feared the diseases they had weaponized against prisoners. Within 48 hours of the first confirmed typhus cases, the entire guard barracks was quarantined. SS doctors arrived from Berlin, bringing with them experimental vaccines and strict protocols that bordered on hysteria. The infected guards were isolated in a separate medical facility, far from the prisoner infirmary, where typhus victims were left to die without treatment. The contrast was staggering and darkly poetic. When prisoners contracted typhus, they were often shot to prevent the spread of infection, or simply left to waste away in overcrowded sick bays with no medicine, no care, no hope. But when SS men fell ill, the full force of Nazi medical resources mobilized to save them. Delousing stations were set up. Every mattress, every blanket, every uniform in the guard quarters was burned and replaced. The barracks were fumigated with Zyklon B, the same poison gas used in the chambers to murder Jews, now deployed to kill the tiny insects that had turned the hunters into the hunted. But the prisoner who had started this biological rebellion knew something the SS doctors didn't. He had not released all of his collection in one location. Over the following weeks, as he continued to be assigned to various work details throughout the camp complex, he methodically distributed the remaining vials in other SS areas. A handful of infected bedbugs in the officers' mess hall, crawling into the seams of wooden benches. Another vial emptied near the laundry facility where guard uniforms were processed, allowing the insects to hitch rides back to individual quarters. He even managed to introduce some into the camp commandant's administrative building, releasing them in a storage room where winter coats were kept. The strategy was guerrilla warfare in its purest form. Strike, disperse, strike again, never in a pattern predictable enough to trace. By mid-April, the outbreak had spread to 27 SS personnel. 2 guards had died, their Aryan blood proving no more resistant to Rickettsia prowazeki than the blood of the prisoners they had tortured. The SS leadership was baffled and enraged. They conducted investigation after investigation, interrogating prisoners, beating capos for information, executing random inmates on suspicion of sabotage. But they were looking for bombs, for poisoned food, for some obvious act of resistance that fit their understanding of rebellion. It never occurred to them that the weapon was invisible, carried by insects no larger than an apple seed, distributed by a man whose face they wouldn't recognize, even if he stood directly in front of them. The prisoner had become a ghost in plain sight, a specter of retribution moving through the camp, with the patience of someone who understood that vengeance, to be truly effective, must be sustained and systematic. He was not trying to destroy the entire SS garrison. That would have been impossible, but he was proving a point that resonated through every barracks in Auschwitz. The masters of death were not invincible. Other prisoners began to notice changes in the camp's atmosphere, subtle shifts that spoke to a crack in the Nazi facade of total control. The guards became paranoid, obsessive about cleanliness, in a way that would have been laughable if it weren't so desperately ironic. Men who had overseen the deaths of thousands through deliberate neglect and disease now scrubbed their quarters daily, burned their clothes at the slightest suspicion of contamination, and refused to enter certain buildings without protective gear. The psychological impact was perhaps even more significant than the physical casualties. The SS had built their power on the illusion of superiority, on the belief that they were a master race immune to the weaknesses that plagued the Untermensch, the subhumans they enslaved. Typhus shattered that illusion. It demonstrated that beneath the uniforms and the ideology, they were just as fragile, just as mortal, just as vulnerable to the consequences of the hell they had created. By early May, the outbreak had claimed 5 SS lives and hospitalized over 40 guards, forcing the camp administration to bring in replacement personnel from other facilities. The investigation continued for months, but they never found the source. They never identified the prisoner responsible. They never even came close. And the man who had orchestrated this act of biological resistance continued his work, collecting, waiting, and when the opportunity arose again, striking. He had transformed himself from victim into warrior, using the only weapon available to him in a place designed to strip away all power, all dignity, all hope. He had taken the camp's own instrument of death and turned it against the executioners, proving that even in Auschwitz, even in the darkest pit of human cruelty, resistance was possible. The success of the operation created an unexpected problem for the prisoner: how to continue without becoming reckless. In the camps, survival depended on invisibility, on being unremarkable enough to avoid the attention of guards and brutal enough to avoid being targeted by fellow prisoners desperate for any advantage. The Typhus attacks had given him a sense of purpose that was both exhilarating and dangerous. Purpose in Auschwitz was a double-edged sword. It could keep you alive by giving you a reason to endure another day, but it could also make you careless, make you believe you were somehow special or protected, when in reality you were just as close to death as everyone else. The prisoner forced himself to slow down, to let weeks pass between attacks, to remember that he was engaged in a war of attrition that would only be won if he survived long enough to continue fighting. He began to study the patterns of the camp more carefully, noting which guards rotated in and out, which areas received the most fumigation attention, which work details offered the best access to SS facilities. During this period of careful observation, he witnessed something that reinforced his resolve and revealed the true depth of Nazi hypocrisy. In June of 1943, Heinrich Himmler himself visited Auschwitz to inspect the camp's efficiency and discuss expansion plans for the gas chambers. The entire complex was transformed for his arrival. Prisoners were forced to clean pathways, paint buildings, remove corpses from view, creating a sanitized version of hell for the architect of the final solution. The SS guards who had been recovering from typhus were hidden away, transferred temporarily to other duties so that Himmler wouldn't see the evidence of disease among his chosen warriors. The visit lasted 3 days, during which Himmler toured the facilities, watched a gassing operation from beginning to end, and complimented the commandant on the industrial efficiency of the murder process. He never asked about the typhus outbreak. He never questioned why so many guards had been replaced. The entire incident had been buried, classified, erased from official reports, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the camp's conditions posed a threat not just to prisoners, but to German personnel as well. The prisoner was part of a work detail assigned to maintain the grounds during Himmler's visit, which meant he stood less than 50 feet from the man who had ordered the deaths of millions. He watched Himmler inspect a row of newly arrived prisoners, watched him nod approvingly, as the selection process divided families into those who would work and those who would die immediately. And in that moment, standing in the spring sunlight with his striped uniform hanging off his skeletal frame, the prisoner understood something profound about the nature of evil. It was not passionate or emotional. It was bureaucratic, methodical, almost boring in its execution. Himmler looked at the condemned with the same expression a factory manager might use when reviewing production quotas. There was no hatred in his eyes, no anger, just cold calculation. And that realization fueled the prisoner's determination more than any emotion could have. He was fighting not against men driven by fury, but against a machine of death that operated with the efficiency of a slaughterhouse. After Himmler's departure, the camp returned to its normal rhythm of horror. The gas chambers resumed their regular schedule. The work details continued their slave labor. The selections continued every few days, culling the weak and the sick. But something had shifted within the prisoner population, a subtle change that the SS either didn't notice or chose to ignore. Word of the typhus attacks had spread through whispered conversations in the barracks, passed from prisoner to prisoner in the coded language that had developed as a survival mechanism. No one knew who was responsible, but everyone knew it had happened. The knowledge that someone had fought back, that someone had weaponized the camp's own tools of extermination against the guards, became a form of resistance in itself. It was proof that the SS were not untouchable, that the machinery of genocide could be disrupted, even if only in small ways, even if the disruption changed nothing about the daily reality of mass murder. The prisoner began to notice other small acts of sabotage throughout the camp. A work detail assigned to construct new barracks would deliberately use green wood that would warp and crack. Prisoners working in the munitions factory would subtly damage components, creating shells that would misfire or fail to detonate. Kitchen workers would steal and redistribute food, creating a shadow economy that kept some prisoners alive a few days longer. None of these acts would end the war or shut down the camp, but collectively, they represented a refusal to cooperate fully with their own extermination. The prisoner realized that his Typhus campaign had become part of a larger pattern of resistance, a silent war being waged by people who had been declared less than human but who continued to assert their humanity through defiance. And he understood that his role in this war was not yet finished. By late summer of 1943, the prisoner had refined his methods to an art form. He had learned which types of containers kept the bedbugs alive longest without feeding, discovered that the insects could survive up to 5 months without a blood meal if kept at the right temperature, and identified the optimal locations for release that would maximize spread while minimizing the risk of immediate detection. The medical block where he worked had become a laboratory of sorts, though not in the way the Nazi doctors intended. While they conducted their grotesque experiments on living human subjects, testing the limits of human endurance through freezing, burning, and deliberate infection, the prisoner conducted his own research into the biology of disease transmission. He observed that bedbugs were attracted to carbon dioxide and body heat, which meant they would naturally migrate towards sleeping humans. He noted that a single fertilized female could lay up to 5 eggs per day, creating exponential growth in population if conditions were favorable. The SS barracks, with their warm mattresses and regular human occupants, provided perfect breeding grounds. The prisoner also began to collaborate, though the word collaboration suggests a level of organization that didn't truly exist. In Auschwitz, trust was a luxury few could afford, and organized resistance movements were quickly infiltrated and destroyed by informants desperate to trade information for extra rations or a few more days of life. But there were others who worked in positions that gave them access to SS areas, and through careful observation and oblique conversations, the prisoner identified potential allies. A man who cleaned the officers' quarters, another who delivered firewood to guard buildings, a third who worked in the camp pharmacy and had access to the same infected insect specimens. These men never spoke directly about what they were doing. They never formed a resistance cell or held meetings. But through subtle gestures and shared understanding, they began to coordinate their efforts, each one introducing infected bedbugs into different areas of the camp infrastructure, creating multiple simultaneous outbreaks that made tracing the source impossible. The cumulative effect became apparent by September. The camp medical logs, which the prisoner occasionally glimpsed while working in the medical block, showed that typhus cases among SS personnel had risen to 73 confirmed infections and 11 deaths. The Nazis had implemented increasingly extreme measures to combat the spread, including the complete destruction and rebuilding of 2 entire guard barracks, the mandatory daily delousing of all personnel, and the introduction of experimental insecticide treatments that were almost as toxic to humans as they were to the bedbugs. Yet the infections continued. The SS doctors, brilliant as they were in the science of murder, failed to grasp a fundamental truth about disease ecology. Once you create an environment saturated with filth, overcrowding, and death, you cannot fully control where the pathogens will spread. The camps had become incubators of plague, and the invisible barrier the Nazis imagined existed between themselves and their victims was a comforting fiction with no basis in biological reality. What the prisoner found most satisfying was not the deaths themselves, though he felt no guilt over the SS casualties. What satisfied him was watching the psychological unraveling of men who had built their identities on the myth of racial superiority. The guards began to exhibit signs of paranoia and obsessive behavior. Some refused to sleep in their assigned barracks, choosing instead to sleep in vehicles or offices. Others developed elaborate cleansing rituals, washing their bodies and uniforms multiple times per day in scalding water that left their skin raw and blistered. A few requested transfers out of Auschwitz entirely, claiming illness or family emergencies, anything to escape what they now perceived as a cursed assignment. The camp commandant issued increasingly desperate orders about hygiene and pest control, orders that were impossible to enforce in a facility designed around the systematic dehumanization and extermination of human beings. You cannot create sanitary conditions in hell, no matter how many regulations you write. The prisoner understood that his actions would not save lives in any meaningful numerical sense. For every SS guard incapacitated by typhus, a replacement arrived within days. For every minor disruption in the camp's operation, the Nazi machine adapted and continued its work of mass murder. By the fall of 1943, Auschwitz was killing approximately 6,000 people per day, at peak efficiency, and nothing the prisoner did would significantly impact that horrific calculus. But he also understood that resistance was not always measured in strategic victories or lives saved. Sometimes resistance was about maintaining your humanity in a place designed to strip it away. It was about refusing to accept the role of passive victim, about fighting back even when the fight seemed futile. It was about making the executioners pay a price, however small, for their crimes. And in that sense, every bedbug he released, every SS guard who fell ill, every moment of fear he instilled in his oppressors was a victory that mattered more than any body count could measure. The autumn of 1943 brought a new challenge that threatened to end the prisoners' campaign before it reached its full potential. The camp administration, frustrated by their inability to stop the typhus outbreaks among SS personnel, decided to implement a radical solution that would eliminate the problem by eliminating the source. They ordered a complete purge of the medical blocks where diseased prisoners were kept, along with a systematic execution of anyone who worked in those facilities and might have been exposed to infected materials. The logic was brutally simple. If they couldn't identify the specific source of contamination, they would destroy everything and everyone connected to the medical operations and start fresh with new personnel and sterilized equipment. The order called for the liquidation of approximately 200 prisoners, including doctors, nurses, orderlies, and anyone who had handled biological specimens over the past 6 months. The prisoner's name was on that list. The selection was scheduled for October 15th, a date that was announced with the same casual efficiency the Nazis used for all their mass murders. The condemned prisoners would be told they were being transferred to another camp, a lie so transparent that even the newest arrivals recognized it for what it was. They would be loaded onto trucks, driven to the gas chambers, disguised as shower facilities, and murdered along with whatever other victims had been selected that day from the regular transports arriving from across occupied Europe. The prisoner had approximately 1 week to either escape, which was virtually impossible, or to somehow get himself removed from the selection list, which was almost equally unlikely. In Auschwitz, being marked for death was a bureaucratic certainty. The Nazi system ran on paperwork and lists, and once your name appeared on the wrong document, your fate was sealed with the same inevitability as a mathematical equation. But the prisoner had one advantage that most condemned men lacked. He understood the SS psychology better than they understood themselves. He had spent months observing them, studying their fears and weaknesses, learning how they thought and what they valued. And he knew that the one thing the Nazis prized above almost everything else was their own health and safety. The typhus outbreak had terrified them precisely because it made them vulnerable in a way that partisan attacks or sabotage never could. A bullet could be avoided with better security. A bomb could be prevented with careful inspections. But disease was invisible, insidious and democratic in its lethality. It didn't care about rank or race or ideology. And the SS guards, for all their cruelty, were fundamentally cowards, who had chosen to wage war on unarmed civilians rather than face real soldiers on a battlefield. The prisoner decided to weaponize that cowardice one final time. He spent the next 3 days deliberately infecting himself with typhus. Using a sterilized needle he had stolen from the medical block, he extracted blood from a prisoner in the advanced stages of the disease, a man whose body was covered in the characteristic rash and who was burning with fever so intense he no longer recognized his own name. The prisoner injected a small amount of that contaminated blood into his own arm, knowing that within days the bacteria would multiply in his system and produce the telltale symptoms that would make him radioactive to the SS. It was an insane gamble, a calculated act of self-destruction, based on the hope that the Nazis would be more afraid of catching Typhus from him than they were committed to executing him. If his timing was wrong, if the symptoms appeared too late or too early, he would simply die of the disease in addition to being murdered. But if he timed it correctly, if he could become symptomatic exactly when they came to collect him for the gas chamber, he might be able to terrify his executioners into quarantining him instead of killing him immediately. The fever began on the morning of October 14th, exactly 24 hours before the scheduled selection. It started with chills that made his entire body shake, despite the relatively mild autumn temperature. By afternoon, his temperature had spiked to dangerous levels, and the characteristic headache of typhus felt like an iron spike being driven through his skull. By evening, the rash had begun to appear on his chest and arms, the red spots that signaled active infection. When the SS guards arrived the next morning to collect the condemned prisoners, they found him collapsed on his bunk, delirious with fever, his body radiating heat, and covered in the unmistakable signs of the disease that had already killed a dozen of their comrades. The guards recoiled in horror. One of them actually vomited at the sight, and in that moment of visceral fear and disgust, the prisoner achieved what months of careful planning had made possible. They quarantined him instead of executing him, isolating him in a separate area of the medical block, while they decided what to do with a man who was both condemned to death and too dangerous to approach. The quarantine cell was a concrete room barely large enough to lie down in, with a single barred window near the ceiling and a bucket in the corner that served as a toilet. The prisoner spent the next 11 days in that space, drifting in and out of consciousness as the typhus ravaged his body. The fever climbed so high that he experienced hallucinations, seeing faces of the dead floating above him, hearing voices of his family members who had been murdered in the gas chambers months earlier. His body became a battlefield where his immune system waged war against Rickettsia prowazeki, and for several days it was genuinely uncertain which side would win. The SS guards who brought his meager rations of bread and water would not enter the cell. They would open a slot in the door, slide the food through, and slam it shut again as quickly as possible, as if even those few seconds of exposure might condemn them to the same fate. No doctor came to examine him, no medication was provided. The Nazis had decided to let the disease run its course, and if he died, they would burn his body and consider the problem solved. But the prisoner did not die. By the end of the second week, his fever broke. The hallucinations stopped. The rash began to fade, leaving behind darkened patches of skin that would remain visible for months. He had survived typhus, an illness that killed approximately 20% of infected individuals, even under good medical care, and he had done it with no treatment whatsoever in the hell of Auschwitz. His survival was partly luck, partly the fact that he had been relatively healthy before the infection, compared to most prisoners who contracted the disease after months of starvation and abuse. But it was also a testament to something harder to quantify: sheer willpower, the determination to live not because life in the camp was worth living, but because dying would mean the SS had won. When the guards finally opened his cell door on October 27th, they found him sitting upright, weak but conscious, his eyes clear and focused. They had expected to find a corpse. Instead, they found a man who had weaponized a deadly disease against them and then survived it himself. The question now was what to do with him. The original selection that would have sent him to the gas chamber had already been carried out. The other prisoners on the list had been murdered 2 weeks earlier, but his name still existed in the camp records as someone who had been marked for liquidation, and the Nazi bureaucracy did not easily forgive or forget such designations. At the same time, the SS doctors were now intensely interested in him for a different reason. A prisoner who had survived typhus without treatment represented valuable data for their research into disease resistance and immunity. The Nazi medical establishment was obsessed with understanding why some people survived infections while others died, not out of humanitarian concern, but because they believed such knowledge could be used to strengthen the Aryan race. The prisoner found himself transferred from the quarantine cell back to the medical block, this time not as a worker, but as a subject for observation and testing. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. The man who had deliberately infected SS guards with typhus was now being studied by SS doctors who wanted to understand his immunity to the disease. They drew his blood repeatedly, measured his vital signs, documented the progression of his recovery with the same meticulous attention to detail they applied to their experiments on unwilling human subjects. But there was one crucial difference. They treated him with a degree of caution that bordered on respect, not because they valued his life, but because they feared what he might still be carrying. A person who had recently recovered from typhus could potentially still harbor and transmit the bacteria for weeks after symptoms disappeared. The doctors wore gloves when examining him, maintained distance, and handled his blood samples with extreme care. He had become, in their eyes, both a valuable research subject and a biohazard, and that dual status provided him with a thin buffer of protection that few prisoners ever experienced. During this period of medical observation, the prisoner made a discovery that would define the final phase of his resistance campaign. While being examined in the laboratory, he noticed that the SS doctors kept extensive records of their disease research, including detailed logs of every typhus case among both prisoners and guards, along with specimens of infected materials stored in a locked refrigeration unit. The unit contained dozens of vials filled with blood samples, tissue cultures, and preserved insect specimens, all meticulously labeled and organized. It was a treasure trove of biological weapons, far more extensive than anything the prisoner had been able to collect on his own, and the SS doctors, confident in their security measures and convinced of their own superiority, had no idea that the man they were studying was already planning how to access that collection. The prisoner realized that his apparent cooperation with the medical examinations, his survival of the disease, and his new status as a research subject had given him something he never could have achieved through stealth alone: legitimate access to the very heart of the camp's disease research program. The question was how to exploit that access before his usefulness to the doctors expired and he was sent back to the general prisoner population, or more likely, quietly eliminated. The prisoner's window of opportunity was narrower than he initially realized. The SS doctors planned to conclude their observations within 3 weeks, after which he would be classified as either fit for work or unfit for continued existence. In Auschwitz, there was no category for recovered patients who were simply released back to normalcy. You either returned to slave labor until you died of exhaustion, or you were deemed too weak to be productive and sent to the gas chambers. The prisoner understood he had perhaps 15 days to execute what would be his most ambitious and dangerous operation yet. The refrigeration unit containing the disease specimens was located in a laboratory that was locked every evening and guarded by a rotating shift of SS personnel. But the guards stationed at the medical block were not the elite soldiers who patrolled the perimeter or manned the watchtowers. They were older men, some recovering from injuries sustained on the Eastern Front, others deemed unfit for combat duty due to health issues or lack of courage. These were the dregs of the SS, and they shared one universal trait: they were terrified of disease. The prisoner began to cultivate a deliberate pattern of behavior designed to make the guards as uncomfortable as possible while simultaneously appearing cooperative with the doctors. During examinations, he would mention feeling occasional chills or phantom symptoms, just enough to remind everyone that typhus recovery was unpredictable and that relapse, while rare, was possible. He would cough occasionally, not violently enough to suggest active illness, but persistently enough to make people nervous. When guards brought his food or escorted him to the laboratory, he would stand slightly too close, would hand items back with deliberate contact, would sneeze unexpectedly. None of these actions were overtly threatening or could be classified as resistance, but collectively they created an atmosphere of unease that made the guards want to minimize their time around him. Within a week, he had trained them to rush through their duties in his presence, to spend as little time as possible in direct contact with him, to cut corners on security procedures, because completing those procedures meant prolonged exposure to a man they viewed as a walking contagion. On November 8th, the opportunity he had been engineering finally materialized. The evening guard assigned to the medical block was a man named Schultz, a 47-year-old Bavarian who had been reassigned to Auschwitz after losing 3 fingers to frostbite during the siege of Leningrad. Schultz was lazy, bitter about his posting, and more interested in drinking schnapps in the guard room than in maintaining vigilant security. The prisoner had observed that Schultz made his rounds every 2 hours like clockwork, but spent the intervening time reading magazines and smoking cigarettes. At approximately 9:30 that evening, the prisoner called out from his cell, claiming he was experiencing severe abdominal cramps and needed to use the latrine immediately. It was a common enough complaint among typhus survivors, whose digestive systems were often permanently damaged by the disease. Schultz appeared at the cell door, clearly annoyed, and made the critical mistake the prisoner had been waiting for. He unlocked the door but did not summon backup before escorting the prisoner down the hallway. The latrine was located at the far end of the medical block, which meant they had to walk past the laboratory where the refrigeration unit was kept. As they passed the door, the prisoner suddenly collapsed, grabbing his stomach and groaning as if in severe pain. Schultz jumped backward, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm, but he did not draw the weapon. The prisoner had calculated correctly. Schultz was more afraid of contamination than he was concerned about escape. A prisoner doubling over in apparent agony was not exhibiting escape behavior, and Schultz's primary instinct was to avoid physical contact. The guard shouted for the prisoner to get up, but when the prisoner remained on the ground, writhing and moaning, Schultz made his second critical error. He turned and walked quickly back toward the guardroom to summon help, leaving the prisoner alone in the hallway for approximately 90 seconds. It was enough time. The prisoner stood up, no longer showing any signs of distress, and tried the laboratory door. It was locked as he had known it would be, but Auschwitz locks were simple mechanisms designed to prevent casual entry, not to stop someone with motivation and knowledge. Using a thin piece of wire he had concealed in his clothing for weeks, the prisoner manipulated the lock mechanism, a skill he had learned in his previous life as a metal worker in Warsaw. The door opened with a soft click. Inside the laboratory, lit only by moonlight filtering through barred windows, the prisoner moved with the speed and precision of someone who had mentally rehearsed this moment dozens of times. The refrigeration unit was exactly where he remembered. A large metal cabinet with a simple padlock that took him less than 20 seconds to defeat using the same wire technique. The door swung open, releasing a wave of cold air and revealing rows of carefully organized vials, each one labeled with dates, specimen types, and infection classifications. He grabbed a canvas medical bag from a nearby shelf and began filling it systematically, selecting the vials marked with the highest pathogen concentrations: typhus, dysentery, typhoid, even several specimens of blood taken from prisoners who had died of unknown hemorrhagic fevers. Within 45 seconds, he had collected 23 vials, representing the deadliest diseases that existed within Auschwitz's walls. He closed the refrigeration unit, relatched the padlock, and slipped back into the hallway, just as he heard Schultz returning with another guard. The prisoner immediately resumed his position on the floor, groaning convincingly. The guards, seeing nothing suspicious except a sick prisoner exactly where they had left him, roughly hauled him to his feet and escorted him to the latrine, never suspecting that the canvas bag now hidden beneath his striped uniform shirt contained enough biological material to infect hundreds of people. The prisoner returned to his cell with the stolen vials concealed against his body, the glass containers wrapped in cloth to prevent them from clinking together, and the cold seeping through the thin fabric of his uniform. He had perhaps 12 hours before the theft would be discovered during the morning inventory check, and when it was, the entire medical block would be locked down and searched with a thoroughness that would make his previous theft seem amateurish by comparison. He could not keep the vials in his cell. He could not risk being caught with them during the inevitable inspection. But he also could not distribute them immediately because the heightened security that would follow the discovery would make movement around the camp nearly impossible for weeks. The prisoner needed a hiding place that was both accessible and beyond suspicion. A location the SS would never think to search because they would never imagine a prisoner would have the audacity or ability to reach it. And then, lying in the darkness of his cell, he remembered something he had observed during Himmler's visit 2 months earlier. The camp commandant's office had a ventilation system that connected to the medical block through a series of air ducts designed to prevent disease transmission between buildings. The air ducts were accessible through grates in the ceiling of certain rooms, including the laboratory he had just burglarized. The prisoner spent the remaining hours of darkness developing a plan so reckless that it bordered on suicidal, but he had long since passed the point where personal survival outweighed the mission. At approximately 4:30 in the morning, during the dead period between the night guard's final round and the beginning of morning roll call, he picked the lock on his cell door for the second time that night and made his way back to the laboratory. The building was silent, except for the distant sound of a guard snoring in the duty room at the front entrance. The prisoner climbed onto a laboratory table, removed the ventilation grate with his bare hands, and pulled himself up into the duct system. The metal shaft was barely wide enough to accommodate his emaciated body, and the darkness was absolute. He crawled forward, dragging the canvas bag behind him, moving entirely by feel and memory of the building's layout. After approximately 30 feet, he found what he was looking for, a junction point where multiple ducts converged, creating a small cavity large enough to hide the bag. He wedged the canvas sack deep into the cavity, covered it with dust and debris to make it invisible even if someone shone a light into the shaft, and then crawled backward to the laboratory. By the time he returned to his cell and relatched the door, the first hints of dawn were appearing through his window. Roll call would begin in 90 minutes. The discovery of the theft would happen shortly after that. The prisoner lay on his bunk and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, knowing that he had just hidden the largest collection of weaponized disease agents in a location that the SS would never search because it was literally above their heads, built into the infrastructure of their own command building. But satisfaction quickly gave way to the realization of what came next. The SS response to the theft would be savage and immediate. They would interrogate everyone who had access to the medical block. They would torture prisoners for information. They would execute suspects on the slightest pretext. The prisoner had no illusions about his chances of surviving that investigation. His recent recovery from typhus and his presence in the medical block during the exact time frame of the theft made him an obvious suspect. He would be questioned, beaten, and ultimately killed, probably within the next 48 hours. But before that happened, he had one final task to complete. The stolen vials were useless if they remained hidden in the air duct forever. They needed to be deployed, and they needed to be deployed in a way that would maximize their impact while minimizing the chance of the SS discovering what was happening until it was too late. The prisoner had already identified his final target, the camp administration building, where the commandant and his senior staff worked, where the bureaucrats who managed the machinery of genocide maintained their offices, where the decisions about life and death were made with the casual efficiency of clerks processing paperwork. These men were the true architects of Auschwitz's horror, more responsible for the mass murder than any individual guard or even any single Nazi leader. They were the functionaries who made the trains run on time, who calculated the most efficient gas chamber occupancy rates, who requisitioned the Zyklon B pellets and the crematorium fuel and the barbed wire. And they worked in climate-controlled offices with carpeted floors and coffee machines, insulated from the suffering they orchestrated by nothing more than a few hundred meters of distance and their own willful blindness. The prisoner knew he would need help to reach the administration building, and for the first time in his campaign, he would have to take someone else fully into his confidence. There was a man named Tomasz, a Polish prisoner who worked as a janitor in the administration building, and who the prisoner had identified months earlier as someone who might be sympathetic to resistance. Tomasz was in his 50s, too old to survive much longer in the camp, and he had the resigned look of someone who had already accepted his death and was simply waiting for it to arrive. That acceptance made him dangerous in the best possible way because he had nothing left to lose. During the morning work detail, as prisoners were being assigned to various tasks throughout the camp, the prisoner managed to position himself near Tomasz and whispered a single sentence that contained no details, but conveyed everything that mattered. "I have a way to make them pay, but I need your help tonight." Tomasz looked at him for a long moment, his weathered face showing no emotion, and then nodded once before walking away. No questions, no hesitation. Just the simple acknowledgement that when the opportunity for vengeance finally arrived, you took it without overthinking the consequences. That night, November 9th, 1943, marked the culmination of a campaign that had claimed the lives of 17 SS personnel and infected over 100 more, though the prisoner would never know the final count. Tomasz, true to his word, left a side door to the administration building unlocked at precisely 10 o'clock. The prisoner retrieved the canvas bag from the ventilation shaft, moving through the darkness with the certainty of someone who had already died in his mind and was now operating beyond fear. He entered the building through the unlocked door and found Tomasz waiting in a supply closet with a janitor's cart and cleaning supplies. Without speaking, the two men began their work. They moved through the building methodically, releasing infected bedbugs into desk drawers, coat closets, filing cabinets, and upholstered furniture. They opened vials of contaminated blood and wiped the liquid onto doorknobs, telephone receivers, and the underside of toilet seats in the officer's bathroom. They introduced typhoid cultures into the water cooler that served the administrative staff. They contaminated the coffee station with dysentery agents. The entire operation took less than 40 minutes, and when they were finished, the administration building of Auschwitz had been transformed into a biological time bomb that would detonate slowly over the coming weeks. The next morning, as predicted, the prisoner was arrested for the theft of the medical specimens. He was taken to the camp interrogation center, a building whose very name was a euphemism for a torture chamber. The SS interrogators beat him for 3 hours, demanding to know where he had hidden the stolen vials. He told them nothing because there was nothing to tell that would make any difference. The vials were empty now, their contents already deployed, the mission already complete. They could search every centimeter of the camp, and they would never recover what had been taken because it no longer existed in a form they could recognize or contain. On the afternoon of November 11th, after determining that torture would not produce the information they wanted, the SS guards dragged the prisoner to the execution wall and shot him. He died without ceremony, without witnesses beyond his executioners, his body thrown into the crematorium with dozens of others who had been murdered that day. The Nazis never learned his name. He exists in the historical record only as a number, one more victim in a sea of millions. But his final act of resistance outlived him by weeks and eventually contributed to consequences far beyond what he could have imagined. By early December, the Auschwitz administration building was experiencing an outbreak of multiple diseases simultaneously. The commandant himself fell ill with typhoid. His deputy contracted dysentery so severe he required emergency surgery. 9 administrative staff members were hospitalized with various infections, and 3 died. The camp's bureaucratic operations slowed to a crawl, as sick officers were replaced with substitutes who didn't understand the systems or the paperwork. Transport schedules were disrupted, supply requisitions were delayed. The smooth machinery of genocide began to develop friction points and inefficiencies. The outbreak was eventually traced to contaminated water and general sanitation failures, but the SS never discovered that it had been a deliberate attack. They implemented new hygiene protocols and rebuilt portions of the administration building, but the damage to morale and efficiency had been done. Several senior officers requested transfers. Others developed chronic health problems that plagued them for the rest of their lives. The prisoner's story disappeared into the chaos of war and genocide, one nameless act of defiance among thousands that were never recorded or recognized. When Auschwitz was finally liberated by Soviet forces on January 27, 1945, the liberators found mountains of evidence documenting Nazi crimes, but almost nothing about prisoner resistance. The narrative that emerged in the immediate post-war years portrayed the camps primarily as sites of victimization, places where people died passively while the world looked away. It would take decades before historians began to uncover and document the countless ways prisoners fought back. The sabotage, the information smuggling, the secret schools and religious services, the mutual aid networks that kept people alive a few days longer, and yes, the biological warfare campaigns waged by individuals who understood that even the smallest act of resistance mattered. The prisoner who weaponized Typhus against his captors was not unique. He was part of a larger pattern of defiance that has only recently begun to receive the historical attention it deserves. Today, very few people know this story. It doesn't fit comfortably into the narratives we prefer about World War II, where heroism is clear-cut and resistance is always noble and obvious. There's something disturbing about celebrating a man who deliberately spread disease, even when his targets were Nazi guards and administrators complicit in mass murder. We want our heroes to be morally uncomplicated, to fight with honor and dignity. But Auschwitz was not a place that allowed for honor or dignity. It was a place designed to destroy both, to reduce human beings to animals fighting for survival. And sometimes survival, sometimes resistance required becoming something darker than we're comfortable acknowledging. The prisoner who collected typhus-infected bedbugs and released them into SS barracks wasn't a saint. He was a man pushed beyond the limits of ordinary morality into a space where the only remaining choice was between complete submission and total war. He chose war, fought it with the only weapons available to him, and died without knowing whether his actions made any difference. But they did make a difference, not because they stopped the Holocaust or saved thousands of lives, but because they proved that even in the deepest pit of human evil, resistance was possible, that the machinery of genocide was not invincible, and that the men who operated that machinery were just as mortal, just as vulnerable, just as afraid as the people they murdered. That truth, uncomfortable as it is, matters. It reminds us that there are no perfect victims, no flawless heroes, only human beings making impossible choices in circumstances beyond imagination. And it forces us to ask what we would do, what we would become, if we found ourselves in a similar hell. The answer is probably more disturbing than we'd like to admit.